Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most persistent mysteries, the great flood myths that appear in cultures from Mesopotamia to Mexico, from India to Iceland. But we're not just retelling familiar stories. We're going to explore the secret flood narratives that rarely make it into mainstream discussions, and we'll examine the hidden numerological patterns that ancient scribes embedded in these accounts. Patterns that some believe hold keys to understanding celestial events and astrological phenomena. Most people know about Noah's Ark from the biblical tradition, but few realize this is actually one of the youngest versions of a much older story. The true origins lie in ancient Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The oldest written flood narrative we have comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically the story of Utnapishtim, but even this builds on earlier Sumerian traditions. In the Sumerian king list, a document dating to around 2100 BCE, there's a fascinating phrase. After the flood swept over the earth and kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Notice what this implies. The flood wasn't just a story, it was treated as a historical dividing line, separating the world into before and after. But here's where it gets interesting. There's an even older account called the Eridu Genesis, dating to around 1600 BCE, but based on much earlier oral traditions. In this version, the god Enki warns a king named Ziusudra about the coming deluge. The text is fragmentary, but what survives describes the flood lasting 7 days and 7 nights. 7 days. Remember that number. Scribes recorded not just the narrative, but also astronomical observations that preceded the flood. They noted specific planetary alignments and lunar phases. This tablet contains what some researchers call antediluvian astronomy, a record of how the ancients tracked celestial events and correlated them with earthly catastrophes. Now here's something that rarely gets discussed. In a 19th century numerological text called The Sacred Science of Numbers, which compiled various esoteric traditions, the author identified a pattern in flood narratives. The number 7 appears repeatedly. 7 days of rain, 7 survivors in some accounts, vessels with 7 compartments. But when you apply certain numerological principles, specifically what the text calls celestial reduction, where numbers are analyzed for their harmonic relationships to planetary cycles, you find that these 7s correspond to lunar quarters and Venus cycles. The text suggests that ancient astrologers who studied these patterns could better predict celestial events by understanding the numerical codes embedded in flood myths. Whether you believe this or not, it's undeniable that ancient Mesopotamian priests were sophisticated astronomers who tracked celestial patterns for both practical and divinatory purposes. Traveling eastwards to ancient India, we encounter one of the most elaborate flood traditions in world mythology, the story of Manu and the fish avatar Matsya. The Satapatha Brahmana, a Sanskrit text from around 800 BCE, tells us that Manu, the first man, finds a tiny fish while performing his morning ablutions. The fish asks for protection and promises to save Manu from an impending flood. Manu places the fish in a jar, but it grows rapidly, requiring ever larger containers until finally Manu releases it into the ocean. The fish, who is actually the god Vishnu in disguise, warns Manu that a great flood will destroy all life. He instructs Manu to build a boat and gather seeds of all plants. When the deluge comes, the massive fish tows Manu's vessel through the raging waters to safety on a mountaintop. But here's the secret version that few people discuss. In some regional variants, particularly in Kerala, traditions recorded in palm leaf manuscripts, the story includes specific astronomical markers. Manu is told to begin building his boat when certain stars appear in particular configurations, what we might call astrological houses today. The Matsya Purana, a later text that expands on this story, contains elaborate numerical systems. It describes the flood as lasting for specific numbers of cosmic years, using a complex calculation system called yugas. One day of Brahma equals 4.32 billion human years, and the flood marks transitions between these cosmic ages. The numerology book I mentioned earlier, The Sacred Science of Numbers, identifies what it calls the Manu pattern, a mathematical relationship between the numbers given in various versions of this flood story and actual astronomical cycles. According to this interpretation, the ancients encoded real astronomical knowledge in mythological form. The numbers weren't arbitrary, they were mnemonic devices for remembering planetary periods, eclipse cycles, and other celestial phenomena. For those interested in Vedic astrology, understanding these numerical patterns was considered essential. The text suggests that by meditating on these sacred numbers and their relationships, practitioners could attune themselves to cosmic rhythms and improve their astrological calculations. The ancient Greeks and Romans had their own flood traditions, less famous than the Mesopotamian accounts, but equally revealing. The primary Greek flood myth centers on Deucalion and Para. According to Apollodorus and other classical authors, Zeus decided to destroy humanity with a flood because of their impiety during the Bronze Age. Prometheus, the Titan who had given fire to humanity, warned his son Deucalion to build a chest, essentially a floating box. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survived 9 days and nights of rain, eventually landing on Mount Parnassus. After the waters receded, they consulted an oracle about how to repopulate the earth and were told to throw the bones of their mother behind them. Cleverly interpreting this to mean stones, the bones of Mother Earth, they did so, and the stones became humans. But there's another Greek flood tradition that's often overlooked. The pre-Hellenic Pelasgians, the indigenous people of Greece before the arrival of Greek-speaking peoples, had their own flood myth involving a figure called Ogyges. The Ogygian flood was said to have occurred during his reign over the ancient land of Attica. This flood was so ancient that it became proverbial. Anything from the time of Ogyges meant something incredibly old. What's particularly interesting is that Greek historians, like Varro, attempted to date this flood astronomically. They correlated it with specific celestial events and calculated it occurred approximately 2,000 years before their own time. The Romans, inheriting Greek traditions, preserved these stories with their own additions. Ovid's Metamorphoses provides one of the most detailed literary accounts of the Deucalion flood, embedding it within a larger narrative of world transformation and rebirth. Now, regarding the numerological aspects, Greek mystery schools, particularly the Pythagoreans, were obsessed with number symbolism. They saw numbers as the fundamental reality underlying all existence. The 9 days and nights of Deucalion's flood would not have been arbitrary to them. In Pythagorean numerology, 9 is the number of completion and fulfillment, as it's the last single digit. The Sacred Science of Numbers text points out that flood narratives often use numbers that were significant in ancient number mysticism. 9 days connects to lunar cycles and also to the 9 months of gestation. The flood as a period of cosmic gestation before the rebirth of humanity. For practicing astrologers in the classical world, understanding these numerical patterns was part of their training. The text suggests that by recognizing how flood myths encoded astronomical cycles, ancient astrologers could better predict future celestial events and their supposed influences on earthly affairs. Here's where the mystery deepens considerably. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, completely isolated from Old World civilizations, indigenous peoples of the Americas developed their own flood traditions that show remarkable parallels to those we've already discussed. The Aztecs believed the world had been destroyed and recreated multiple times. The fourth world, called Four Water, was destroyed by a great flood that lasted 52 years. Only 2 humans survived by hiding in a hollow log, a man named Tata and a woman named Nena. According to the tradition, the god Tezcatlipoca had warned them, instructing them to hollow out a great cypress tree and take only 1 ear of maize each. Notice the parallel structure: divine warning, specific survival instructions, preservation of the human race through a select pair. Moving north, the Ojibwe people tell of Nanabojo, a spirit being who warned a man named Wenabuju about a coming flood. Wenabuju built a raft and saved animals, eventually creating new land by sending various creatures to dive for mud from the flooded world. The Hopi tradition speaks of multiple world destructions, with one world ending in water. The righteous were saved by being sealed in hollow reeds. The Inca had flood traditions involving Viracocha, the creator deity, who destroyed the world in a deluge, saving only a man and woman at Tiwanaku to repopulate the earth. But here's the truly fascinating part. Many of these Native American traditions included specific astronomical markers. The Aztec calendar system was intimately connected with their flood mythology. The 52-year period mentioned in their flood story corresponds to the calendar round, the time it took for their 260-day ritual calendar and 365-day solar calendar to realign. The Mayan Popol Vuh describes multiple creations and destructions, with floods playing a role. Their astronomical knowledge was extraordinarily sophisticated, tracking Venus cycles, lunar eclipses and other phenomena with remarkable precision. The numerological text I've been referencing notes something peculiar. When you examine flood narratives globally, certain numbers appear with unusual frequency. 7, 40, 9 and 12 show up repeatedly, and these numbers all have significance in ancient astronomical observation and astrological systems. 12, for instance, is fundamental to astrology, the 12 signs of the zodiac, based on the 12 lunar cycles in a year. 7 corresponds to the 7 visible planets known to ancient astronomers. 40 relates to various astronomical cycles and appears in multiple flood traditions, including the biblical 40 days and nights. The text proposes that these numbers weren't random, but were teaching tools, embedding astronomical knowledge in memorable narratives. For an astrologer, understanding these patterns supposedly provided deeper insight into celestial mechanics and their interpretation. Now let's talk more specifically about these hidden numerical patterns and what they might mean for understanding both ancient thought and astrological traditions. The Sacred Science of Numbers, published in 1908 by a scholar who went by the pseudonym Cephariel, compiled numerological traditions from multiple cultures. While much of the content is speculative and should be approached critically, it does identify some genuine patterns in how ancient cultures used numbers. The text identifies what it calls the flood pattern, a set of numerical relationships that appear in flood myths worldwide. These include the numbers 7, 12, 40, 52 and 108. Let me explain the potential significance of each. 7, the 7-day week, the 7 visible planets, the 7-year cycles noted in various ancient traditions. In Mesopotamian astronomy, 7 was associated with completion and perfection. The 7 days of the Gilgamesh flood might encode a week, but also the 7-day lunar quarter. 12, the 12 months of the year, the 12 signs of the zodiac, the 12 hours of day and night. This number appears in the structure of many flood narratives, whether in the number of survivors, the divisions of the vessel, or the time periods involved. 40. This is perhaps the most interesting. 40 days and nights appears in the biblical flood, but 40 also corresponds to various astronomical cycles. The Pleiades, a star cluster used for calendar keeping by many cultures, are invisible for 40 days during their heliacal setting. Some ancient cultures use this 40-day period as a marker in their calendars. 52, as mentioned with the Aztec tradition, this was their calendar round period. But 52 also has significance in other astronomical calculations, particularly relating to Venus cycles, 108. This number is sacred in Hinduism and Buddhism, appearing in everything from prayer beads to temple architecture. It relates to astronomical calculations. The distance from Earth to the Sun is approximately 108 times the Sun's diameter, and the distance from Earth to the Moon is approximately 108 times the Moon's diameter. Coincidence, ancient ignorance, or sophisticated observation encoded in sacred numerology. The numerological text suggests that ancient peoples embedded these astronomical observations in their myths as a form of preservation. Myths were memorable, passed down orally for generations, while specific astronomical data might be lost or corrupted. By encoding the data in mythological narratives with specific numerical markers, the information could survive. For astrologers, both ancient and modern, understanding these patterns was said to improve practice. The text claims that by meditating on these sacred numbers and their cosmic correspondences, an astrologer could attune to celestial rhythms and improve both calculations and intuitive interpretations. Now, I want to be clear, we should approach these claims with healthy skepticism. Much of numerology, especially in its more mystical forms, lacks scientific support. However, it's undeniable that ancient cultures did encode astronomical knowledge in various forms, including mythology, architecture, and ritual. The question isn't whether mystical numerology is real, but whether ancient peoples used numbers symbolically to preserve and transmit knowledge. The answer to that question is almost certainly yes. What's truly remarkable is the global pattern. Why would cultures separated by vast oceans with no contact develop such similar flood narratives with similar numerical patterns? Several theories exist. One, there was a common origin, perhaps stemming from a real catastrophic flood event in prehistoric times, that was preserved in ancestral memory as populations dispersed. Two, these stories represent independently developed explanations for geological evidence of ancient floods that various cultures observed in their landscapes. 3. The human mind, confronted with similar natural phenomena and similar needs to explain cosmic order, generates similar mythological structures. The secret great flood myths reveal something profound about human consciousness and our relationship with the cosmos. Whether these stories preserve memories of real catastrophes, encode astronomical knowledge, or represent universal psychological patterns, they connect us to our ancient ancestors across vast gulfs of time and space. The numerical patterns we've explored, whether you view them as mystical keys to astrological wisdom or as mnemonic devices for astronomical observation, demonstrate the sophistication of ancient thought. These weren't primitive people making up random stories. They were our intellectual ancestors, creating complex systems to understand and preserve knowledge about the world and cosmos. For modern practitioners of astrology or anyone interested in ancient wisdom traditions, studying these patterns offers insight into how our ancestors thought about celestial influences and cosmic cycles and bien. Whether the numerological interpretations enhance astrological practice is ultimately a question each practitioner must answer for themselves. What we can say with certainty is that flood myths represent one of humanity's most persistent and widespread narrative traditions. They appear on every inhabited continent. They span millennia, and they continue to fascinate us today. In their repetition of certain themes and numbers, they may indeed preserve ancient knowledge, whether astronomical, historical, or psychological. The flood myths tell us something profound about the human experience. They speak to our vulnerability before natural forces, our struggle to understand suffering and disaster, our need to find meaning in catastrophe, and our hope for renewal and fresh beginnings. Whether rooted in specific historical events or emerging from universal psychological patterns, or most likely both, flood myths represent one of humanity's oldest and most enduring stories. The floods have receded, but the stories remain, carrying secrets that we're still learning to decode. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient flood traditions and their hidden patterns, please like this video and subscribe for more content on ancient and medieval history from around the world. Let me know in the comments which flood tradition fascinated you most, or if you've encountered other interesting numerical patterns in ancient texts. And if you want to explore these topics further, I've included some academic sources in the description below, along with references to the numerological text we discussed. Until next time, keep exploring the ancient world.